Thank you so much for joining our webinar. We had a few housekeeping things on the screen earlier, and so if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you again for being part of AGU CVD 2017. We are thrilled to welcome you to our kickoff webinar that we hope will make you feel more prepared before you come to DC. So I'll start by introducing our speakers that are here at AGU headquarters. I am Carissa Bunge. I am a public affairs specialist here at AGU. We have Brittany Webster, who is the other public affairs specialist here, and Timia, our public affairs analyst. And finally, we have Shane Hanlon, who is our sharing science specialist. And like I mentioned before, we are planning on leaving some time at the end to answer your questions. So please just send them in the chat box as you think of them, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. Like I mentioned, my name is Carissa Bunge. I'm going to give you a little rundown on what you can expect throughout the event. So I thought I'd start with a few of our goals. Really the first goal of our Congressional Visit today is to educate congressional offices about the importance of the geosciences to their state or district. And Brittany's going to be discussing later on how to do the research into what might be the most compelling messages about the importance of geosciences to bring to the office you visit. Our second goal is connecting the importance of geosciences to the need for strong federal geoscience funding and other policies. Our team will be supplying you with information about how federal science has been kind of historically funded and what levels of funding we're asking for in visits, in addition to materials that you can bring to the offices about funding for science. And our third goal is to build connections between congressional offices and local geoscientists, so yourselves, with a longer-term goal of having scientists be a resource for those offices and have continued communication between those two. Like we mentioned during your phone interviews, it's important to us that you each develop long-term relationships with the offices you meet so that you can become a valuable point of contact for the office rather than someone who just stopped in once. And then finally, our fourth goal is to introduce more geoscientists to science policy and provide the skills and information needed for ongoing engagement with policymakers. So we really hope you find this event just as useful as we do and that you can kind of share this information with your colleagues moving forward. So at this point, I'm sure you have a bunch of questions about what to expect during the event. So we wanted to start off with kind of a high-level overview of the timeline moving forward. So the first thing we have on here is that you will need to do some preparation and homework before you come to DC. And we discussed this in our CVD video. If you have not watched it yet, you definitely should go to our website and check it out. And we really asked you in that video to do some research into a few things. One would be the issues important to your community. Two being how your science benefits your community. And three, how federal funding impacts or supports this science. So we also asked you that you could take some time to contact your government relations office, and each institution typically has one. So you might ask them for information and maybe even a one-pager about how your university is making a local impact. And this data will be very useful when talking to your legislator about the value of your science and science more broadly. So once you've done some homework and a little preparation, you'll come to DC for our workshop on May 2nd. And there we'll really go over the nitty-gritty of the federal science budget, how Congress works, how to have a successful day on the Hill, and really give you time to practice with your teams to get ready for your meetings the following day. And this half-day workshop will be followed by a happy hour with AGU staff, just some further icebreakers and really getting to know everyone that's involved. And then the following day on May 3rd, you'll have a full day of about typically 6 to 8 congressional meetings. And each of these can run from 15 minutes to an hour, to half an hour, depending on a number of factors. And your visits will probably wrap up around 4 or 5 p.m. And this will be followed by another happy hour to kind of get a chance to debrief with other teams, share experiences, and really just kind of continue having conversations with other participants about how the day went. And then after you go home, kind of our follow-up with offices, you'll probably spend a few hours to follow up with congressional offices and kind of build on those relationships that you've started. And this includes sending thank you emails and any materials that you may have spoken about in meetings or follow-up information to send to offices. And then finally, that last step, as a part of CVD, we require a few follow-up actions of participants to ensure that you maintain relationships and connections with congressional offices. So we ask a few things. One, that you follow up and check in with the office, probably via email on a quarterly basis. Two, that you invite your legislators to visit your institution or university to continue building that relationship. Then the third thing we have is that you participate and include colleagues perhaps on local visits with the district offices. And usually the best time to do those is during congressional recess, and we will have plenty of materials to help you kind of throughout that process and to make those meetings and everything. And these actions are all very important to keep up those relationships and remind those offices that you're a resource. And of course, you will have AGU assistance through every step of the way. We are here to answer any and all of your questions. So now that you have an idea of what to expect during CVD, it's important that you remember some key items to pack to ensure that you have a great experience. So the first thing we have on here is business cards. These are like currency in DC. Before every meeting, you'll exchange business cards with congressional staff. So you want to make sure you have a good stack of business cards with you. Those institutional handouts I mentioned, if you get in touch with your government relations office, they can certainly help you with those. And Brittany will be sharing some further information about what you should include in those. Also, just a reminder to be bringing business attire. You will probably be wanting to wear a suit to the Hill, and when you have congressional visits. And the first day for our training day, it's business casual. So just be sure to bring some business attire. And along with that, some comfortable shoes. There's a lot of walking to be done on the Hill, especially walking between the Senate and House sides. And then finally, we have a camera, so you can capture some really great moments, especially if you meet with your senator or representative. And then finally, we have an umbrella just because DC weather can be quite unpredictable. So next, here's a look at our teams for this year's event. We were lucky to have some really great applicants from which we have selected the 11 of you for your interest, communication skills, and constituency in key legislators, districts, or states. And we have created 5 teams based on geographic location and scientific expertise in order to meet with important congressional offices. So every team consists of 2 to 3 teammates, plus an AGU staff lead, and they'll really be setting up your meetings, helping your team prepare during the workshop, and attending the meetings with your team. And they will also make sure that you get where you need to be for each meeting, help take notes during the meeting so you can focus on the conversation, and really assist you with follow-up. And they'll be there to answer any questions and help you throughout the entire process, so don't hesitate to ask them really anything. So now that you have gotten an idea of the overview of the event, I'm going to be turning it over to the rest of the AGU CVD team. They're going to be going over kind of how to prep for your meetings, the general concepts of our messages that we'll be bringing to the Hill, give you a quick Congress 101 refresher, and kind of tell you more about how to communicate effectively. So I'm going to be turning it over to Brittany Webster to talk about how to prepare for Capitol Hill.
Great, thanks, Carissa. Hi, everyone. In preparation for your visit to DC, I'm going to give you a brief Congress 101 refresher, and then talk about who you'll be meeting with in DC, and then discuss some of the research you'll want to do to prepare for your meeting with your legislators. So how a bill becomes a law, kind of everything you remember from Schoolhouse Rock. So generally, legislation is introduced in one chamber at a time, and then it has to go through the committee process. And committees are bodies that have authority over particular issue areas. One note on members of committees: members of Congress generally have an interest in the topic, because members get to pick the committees they sit on. And so generally they sit on committees that relate to their districts or their particular areas of expertise, because really sitting on a committee gives you some sense of authority over a given legislative issue. At the same time, though, not every member of Congress gets their first choice. So sometimes you do have members sitting on committees that are maybe not, I'll say, of great personal interest to them. But so legislation will move through the committee. Sometimes it starts on a subcommittee level before moving to the full committee level. And once it's at the full committee level, they will vote on the bill, and then they will send that bill out to the full chamber, often called the floor, which then gets the opportunity to vote on the bill. However, before a bill becomes a law, it has to be passed in the exact same form by the other chamber. So if it starts out in the House, then the Senate has to pass the exact same bill. But often the Senate and the House differ a lot. And so more likely than not, the bill does not pass the Senate and the House in the same form. And if that happens, it has to go through a conference process where the two chambers will work out the differences of the two versions, and then that final version, or the conference bill, will go back to both chambers for final passage. Only then does it go to the president for a signature or veto. Now you can see why, even under the best of circumstances, very few bills become law. So each chamber has procedural hurdles. For example, the House has a Rules Committee that decides how bills, the rules for voting on a bill on the floor. And in the Senate, any individual senator can try to block a bill by filibustering it, which means that 60 votes are needed before any bill in the Senate can really proceed. In addition, partisanship in politics can get in the way of any bill. It could be that substantively the two parties may agree, or at least be close on an issue, but one party doesn't want to give another party a win. Or, it might be election season and it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea to pass this bill at this time. And when we have a split government, as in a president and a Congress of different parties, that can also be very disruptive of the legislative process, as we saw, I would say, the last year of Obama's presidency. And lastly, in a time of tight budgets, things that would otherwise be a priority can be hotly contested or simply ignored. So speaking of bills, I'm going to talk about really the main two types of bills you really need to talk about, or you need to know about. And these are really the two major types of legislation that Congress deals with on a predictable basis. Of everything that passes through Congress, roughly 90% is what is known as authorizing legislation. However, the only type of bill that Congress must pass every year are spending bills or appropriations bills. If Congress doesn't pass these bills, the government shuts down. However, as we see in the slide above, it doesn't always work that way, even for spending bills. That's why in recent years, we've seen either the government actually shut down or Congress pass bills that simply keep the government going, we see the government funded at previous year's spending limits. These temporary bills are called continuing resolutions, and they've done a lot of these in the past couple of years. Now, just so that I'm clear on what authorizing and appropriation bills really are. So an authorization bill establishes federal programs, and appropriation bill outlines how much money will be spent on a given agency or program during the next fiscal year. So who is minding the ship? Who's making all these decisions? Congress really is a world within itself, and a basic understanding of a congressional office and the different types of staffers and why they matter will really go a long way towards how influential your visit will be. The first thing I'd like to point out is the sheer number of staffers on the Hill. There are over 13,000 congressional staff for a total of 535 members of Congress when you include both House and Senate. You'll notice in the graph that these staffers are split between committee staff and personal office staff. So now I want to share with you a typical a diagram of a typical congressional office. Highlighted in yellow are the legislative staffers who you will most likely be meeting with during your visits. The other person to note is the scheduler under the office staff heading. The scheduler handles the congressperson's schedule, and if you're looking to request a meeting with your legislator in the DC or district office, this is the person to contact. So next I want to kind of turn to the demographics of congressional staff. This is just a very general picture of the congressional staff that you might be meeting with, kind of in terms of both in the House and the Senate. And one thing I want to specifically mention is, especially on the House side, staffers often have large legislative portfolios. So it's important that you be able to grab a staffer's attention with information that's important to them and their office. Another note, more likely than not, you're going to have meetings with staffers who are much younger than you. But don't discredit them. They are their boss's eyes and ears and have their boss's respect and attention. Sorry about that. So now that we know a little bit about kind of Congress's processes and who you'll be meeting with, I want to turn to preparation. This is really one of the most essential elements to having a successful congressional visit. It's what you do before you come to DC. You need to bring the right sets of things: appropriate business clothes, business cards, and a very, very short fact sheet or report you can leave behind. But most importantly is to know some information about the congressional offices with whom you'll be meeting, and to think in advance about what you might say, and to have a couple of different versions, the most basic to a bit more in-depth, to tailor to your audience. I'm going to cover the first two elements, and then Timia will cover the third. So first, you're going to want to check out your Member of Congress's website to search for information about your Member of Congress. It's really the best place to start. And this is a good place to find out what issues are important to your legislator, what are the legislator's constituents like, what are their positions on bills that you think are important, and what's their past voting record. And another thing to think about when researching your Member of Congress is to find out kind of more about them on a personal level. What was their previous profession? Where did they go to school? These are all things that can be helpful to keep in mind as you think about whether you have anything in common and how you might build a connection to the office and help the office build a connection to your research. So I would suggest starting with your Member of Congress's website, but congress.gov can be very helpful for finding out information about legislation they've introduced or co-sponsored and how they voted on legislation. But don't discount also checking out their social media pages as well. And as Carissa mentioned, you're going to want to check out you're going to want to get in touch with your institution's government relations staff. They often have existing relationships and knowledge about the offices you'll be visiting that you can build off of. And I can almost guarantee they'll also just want to know that you're going and doing these visits as well. It's helpful for them to also build a relationship on your behalf. And so next I'm going to talk about one-pagers. So it's a really good idea to make sure you have a one-pager or leave behind, which includes information on your research or expertise, as well as your contact information. You'll want to keep it to one page so it's not too much reading for busy staffers, and that it provides an overview and a few bullet points on the importance of your work and a tailored ask, which we will have as well. If you have more information, videos, or pictures from a project, I would urge you to consider hyperlinking that information, because in your follow-up email, you're going to want to send the staffers an e-version of your one-pager, so that's a great way to kind of link to more information. And now I'll turn it over to Timia.
Awesome, thanks so much. So now that we've talked about our goals for this year's CVD and given you some information about how to prepare for your meetings, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about your message and what we call the ask. First, let's start by reiterating something that Brittany mentioned and something that Shane will discuss in the next section. It's really all about effective communication here. one key way to ensure that your message is really effective is to connect your message to your legislators' values and priorities. You really want to meet them where they are. Though it may be tempting to just explain the science to them, we need to really frame the story and connect it to messages that will resonate with your legislator. So we'll help you do that by talking about some of the framing that we use when we talk about our messages. So when I talk about framing the message, what I really mean is use the research that Brittany talked about to determine the priorities and values of your members of Congress and see if you can then connect your message to those values. For example, is your member of Congress a doctor or was in a previous life? Then maybe talking about how your science promotes healthy communities might be a great connection that will resonate with them. First and foremost, what we try to do every time, and we encourage you to do every time you meet with a member of Congress, is to highlight the local connections, meaning you should talk about how your science impacts your local community. Remember, members of Congress represent you as their constituents, so if it helps their district, it will likely resonate with them. In addition to the local connections, we also have a few different frames that AGU uses. These are our core themes that we've used and continue to use when we talk about the value of science. These include national security, jobs and economy, public health and safety. So in addition to the local connections, these are some ways that you can frame your message to themes that will resonate with members of Congress. So keep that in mind when you're crafting your message. Now let's turn over to the ask. So in addition to framing your message, you really need to consider and include an ask in your message. And I know that this seems really weird because in average conversation you don't usually come equipped with an ask, but in DC it's really important because the ask is lingo for the purpose of your visit, and it's really expected. Actually, it may be viewed as wasting a staff member's time if you don't come with a specific ask because then they're not sure what you want from them. So your ask can be anything from requesting that your member of Congress vote a particular way on a bill, or simply letting them know that you're an expert in a specific topic that's of interest to their district and you'd be happy to be a resource. When explaining your ask, make sure it is clear, concise, and discuss the relevance to the state or district. Again, local connections, very, very key. And also be sure to include this on the leave behind material that Brittany mentioned earlier. For this CVD, we've actually prepared 3 asks for you to choose from. We're happy to work with you if you have an additional ask, but please run this by the AG Public Affairs staff to ensure that it doesn't conflict with our other messaging, make sure it's timely, and is aligned with AGU's policy. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, please reach out to your staff lead. Okay, so in the next couple slides, please don't take a ton of notes. This information is included in your pre-webinar packet, and we will be giving you more resources and one-pagers that you can use on the Hill. So you don't have to have all of this completely memorized right now. So the first type of ask that we have this year is with federal funding for science or appropriations, which Brittany also mentioned before. Appropriation asks are really common. They're really common because these are the 12 bills that fund the entire federal government, and they're must-pass bills every year. So we have specific asks related to Earth and Space Science agencies, including NSF, NASA, NOAA, and USGS. Before I go into the asks, I'd just like to take a step back and give you a little background about the current federal funding landscape. Right now, we are currently operating under a continuing resolution, or CR. Brittany also mentioned this previously. They've been passing a lot of these. That CR is scheduled to run out this week, so very, very exciting time for federal funding. CRs really leave federal level stagnant, and they bring a lot of uncertainty to the federal funding landscape, so they're not always things that we love to have from a science perspective. But in addition to the CR work and what you've been hearing in the news about funding the government past this week, you've also probably seen the president's budget, which outlined significant cuts to federal science agencies. So now is really an important time to be talking about funding for science. One thing to note is that Congress has to pass these appropriations bills through both chambers. So we really need to be bridging the gap and talking to these members of Congress about the importance of science to help be our champions in this appropriations process. So this is a very timely ask. So here are some specific funding asks, you will see this again in the pre-webinar packet. We will also cover this more in detail at the workshop when you're here in DC. But just to give you a little bit of an overview, we're asking for money for NSF at $8 billion. And really here what we're trying to emphasize with NSF, going back to framing your message, is talking about things like STEM education. Sorry, folks. There we go. Great. Okay, so for NSF, we're really thinking about STEM education levels, the ability of NSF to strengthen our economy, and its role in maintaining scientific and innovation competitiveness. We're also asking for specific funding for NASA at $20.48 billion. Sorry, there's a typo on the slide. We really want to point out divisions like Earth Science, Planetary Science, and Heliophysics, particularly for Earth Science, which has been on the chopping block in previous budgets. We just want to make sure that we're talking about the importance of these programs. AGU is requesting $6.1 billion for NOAA, and we really want to talk about here the more accurate forecasting, building more resilient communities, and improving our national disaster preparedness as some of our talking points. And then also for USGS, we're requesting $1.2 billion. And really, USGS hasn't really seen funding increases above 2% for 6 years. And so we really want to make sure they get a boost so they can do a lot of the important work that they are focused on as part of their mission. So I didn't really go into a lot of detail about why we chose these numbers, but there is a document in your pre-webinar packet that has a little bit more description on how we came up with these numbers, and we're happy to talk more about this at the workshop, or if you have questions, please let us know. One thing that I'd like to mention is if you're a federal employee, you are not permitted to ask for specific funding. So keep that in mind when you're crafting your message, and we can also help you deal with the ask if you're in that situation. So let your staff lead know. Okay. In addition to funding asks, AGU also has 2 issue-specific asks. And one of them is opposing bad science legislation, and the other one is asking members of the House of Representatives to join the Earth and Space Science Caucus. So first, let's start with the legislation piece here. We're asking that members oppose any legislation or amendments that are damaging to important geoscience research, including harmful riders to appropriations bills. So let's break this down just a little bit. First, let's talk about these appropriations riders. So members of Congress usually use appropriations bills, which you have to pass every year, in order to pass legislation that would normally not pass on its own. And these policies do what we call ride the appropriations bill, which is where the term rider comes from. So past riders associated with science have done things like try to prohibit agencies from using any funds to support the U.S. Global Climate Research Program, or the National Climate Assessment, or they've referred to prohibiting funds for IPCC. So we really want to make sure that members of Congress know that they can support science by opposing these really harmful riders. In addition to harmful riders related to appropriations bills, we're also asking them generally to oppose harmful bills and amendments that are detrimental to geoscience and inhibit the scientific process. As you may have seen in the news, there's been a number of pieces of legislation and some executive orders around the scientific integrity and the scientific process, and we just want to make sure that we are really helping the scientific enterprise by supporting, not impeding the scientific process. So that's also part of our ask there. Now, our final ask that I want to mention is the House Earth and Space Science Caucus. This is really a bipartisan caucus that we are a part of, that we've been leading the charge on, that is meant to broaden congressional awareness of societal, economic, and scientific advancements that are made possible by Earth and space sciences. So members of Congress join caucuses pretty regularly. They're a common thing on the Hill. They raise political awareness or increase momentum around a policy issue or a cause. Caucuses can be bipartisan, but sometimes they're partisan, and they can be about a particular issue or just general policy area. Caucuses are driven by a lawmaker's interests, and they're effective tools for building coalitions that you wouldn't think were likely. So AGU is really requesting that members of Congress join the Earth and Space Studies Caucus to really increase their awareness about the breadth and value of geoscience. And we're targeting the House side for 2 reasons. We're doing that because we want to develop champions there, but also because caucuses are just more common and active on the House side. So you'll see in our leave behinds, we have one for the Senate, one for the House. The House will include the caucus ask there. So keep that in mind. So for more detail about these asks, including the specifics about the funding request and more information about the caucus, I really encourage you to look back over the pre-webinar packet. We will obviously cover this more at the workshop. And please don't hesitate to reach out to your staff lead. We really want to make sure that you're comfortable with your ask, that you understand the ask. So if you have any questions, please reach out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shane, who's going to really help you use a lot of the things that I talked about now into really crafting an effective personal story.
Great. Thanks, Timia. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, talk about crafting your personal story. All right, so I'm going to start with a story. So this is a story about, it starts with a parable in this nice town where everyone lived in harmony with their surroundings. And then this thing, this blight crept in. There's this evil. It caused disease to flocks of chickens and cattle and made people sick as well. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with this? What does this have to do with me or science? Well, this is actually the beginning of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, where she talked about the pesticide DDT and all of its harmful effects on wildlife and human health. And she starts this story about this very serious issue about this environmental pollutant with a story, and it really pulls in the reader. And so we're not asking you to be Rachel Carson, but this is a great example of using stories to illustrate a very serious point and to reel in your audience. So you're going to be with your legislator or with their staff, and you're there for a very specific purpose, whether you're asking for funding or to vote a certain way in a certain bill or to join the join a certain caucus or show support for a specific science issue or whatever it is. Throwing a ton of scientific information at them by diving into really technical components of your research probably isn't going to be that successful, or you're probably not going to be that successful about getting your message across, whatever your purpose is or whatever your ask is. You're going to be excited and maybe nervous, and it's going to be a really invigorating experience, but your time is limited. So you want to make sure that you make things personal and memorable, and storytelling is a really great way to do that. And the illustration up here, though, let me tell you about my research. You don't want to do this. I myself, as a former research scientist, I had probably a fair number of instances where I just wanted to tell everyone about my research. I was really excited about it, and they might have been running away from me in this way. And when you're talking to your legislator or their staff or whomever, you want to make sure that you're speaking the same language as your audience. And so you might be talking to them and about some really technical issue and thinking that they're really engaged and they understand what you're talking about and they're really receptive to it, when in fact it might just sound like noise, or they might not be able to understand or might not be receptive to it. And so regardless of who you're talking to and regardless of what your message is, you want to make sure that you're speaking the same language as your audience. So of course, one of the best ways to do this is to reduce or eliminate your jargon. And so we put up this watch your words sheet. So a common mistake is to use words that have multiple meanings. So they mean one thing to non-scientists, mean another to scientists. And we have a bunch of other resources at our Sharing Science website. The address is there for more communication tips. But just being aware of some of these potential communication pitfalls will really help get your message across. So I started with a story, and the idea here is you might be asking yourself, well, what does a story have to do with me? It's easy to want to talk about how awesome your research is from a scientific standpoint, but again, legislators, their staff, they might not be really receptive to this. They want to know how it affects them, or more importantly, probably their constituents. So that's when storytelling comes in really handy. Everyone's research, everyone's message can be made into a story in some sort of way. And storytelling is really important, and it's a really important part of culture. People have been telling stories since they've been talking. We have folk tales, we have histories, we grow up with stories when we're younger, or we're exposed to stories when we're younger. It's Dr. Seuss, I was exposed to Richard Scarry. And then we see stories all the time in popular culture, the TV show you watch, the book that you read, the conversations you're having with friends and family. So you're probably thinking, well, how is my science a story? The great thing about stories is that we recognize them, even if not consciously. Everyone understands stories. Everyone understands the themes within stories. And there's a science behind storytelling. There's a biological component to it. So, for example, with dopamine, the brain releases dopamine into the system when it experiences an emotionally charged event. It makes it easier to remember with greater accuracy. Listeners who a storyteller and a listener of a story, they actually experience similar brain chemistry, which also helps to make the story more memorable and helps you make that connection. So there's actual science behind effective storytelling. And a great way to think about, well, how do I start with a story, or I don't even know where to get started with this, is thinking about narrative themes. And what I mean by this is that science lends itself to a bunch of narrative themes. So you have something like the quest or the journey. Think about Lord of the Rings, for example. The mystery, Sherlock, is one of the best examples of this. A stranger comes to town and nothing will ever be the same. Think Great Gatsby. Science-wise, quest or a journey, I mean, everyone's research is a quest or a journey, especially if you do field work. But I mean, not just field work. It's if you're in the lab, if you're a modeler, it doesn't really matter. You're on a journey to figure something out. You're on this quest. The mystery, hypothesis testing is a mystery. The picture up here is coral reef bleaching. I studied amphibian diseases when I was a researcher, and so what was causing these, what was this disease causing? What was causing these mass die-offs? And a stranger comes to town. Again, a lot of science can be put into these different themes. It's just a matter of thinking about what research, what theme can your research be put into. But it doesn't even necessarily have to be research. So think about, what's your story? Remember, you're trying to relate to your audience. Your audience is going to be your legislator. So they're going to care about things like local economic successes, success stories from some of your students maybe, or some of your peers and colleagues. You could talk about how your lab supports students. Talk about how research helps your community, your district, your state. Pay attention to success of your institution. Again, your legislator is going to care about these things because these are things all in their backyard, and these are things that affect you and affect their constituents. And it's critical for this audience, for your legislator, that a story is attuned to this place or this district or the state. So it's really important to go back to what Timia was talking about earlier, to frame your story well, frame your message in a way that's really impactful. And so you want to make sure that you present your message in a context that's important to that audience. Again, is it in their district? Does it relate to the university? Does it relate to the state, depending on what level it is? And no matter what, think about framing your story in a way when you find a common goal or a common group. So you already care about X, well, and this is what happens because of that. So I have here, we all care about, so if you can say things like certain people, health, water quality, food supply, jobs, economy, whatever it is, you find that common footing between you and your legislator. That's where your story is really going to resonate and your message overall. And no matter what, keep things positive. Then this might be really difficult because we're talking about budget cuts. We're talking about maybe science that's like climate change or something, science that might not have what seemed like really positive results. But by keeping your message positive, that's going to resonate with your audience no matter who they are. So you want to end on a positive note, how science can be part of a solution, or how your legislator can help this science along to have this positive message. So instead of the example we use is asking people to recycle at the end of the world, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Think about this. We have a great opportunity to safeguard our quality of life and make sure that our communities, health, resources, and environment are enjoyed by generations to come. Again, ending on a positive note is going to make you more memorable, and it's going to end the conversation on a note where your legislator, their staff will think, oh yeah, this is something we can do. That was a really great conversation. I'm going to follow up with this. All right. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brittany.
Great, thanks, Shane. Oh, there we go. Just a little delay there. No, we've moved too fast. Okay, well, thanks, Shane. That was a really great overview. So I just want to wrap up this presentation portion of our event with some homework in preparation for your meetings. We will go over a lot of this in more detail at the workshop, and we'll have time to practice in our teams, but we thought it'd be useful for you to have some of this in mind while you're preparing at home. In order to get the office to see why they should support your request to support science funding, you really need to explicitly show them why it's valuable to them. It may help to think about what you would write in the broader impacts section of a grant proposal, why your research and message should be of concern to the office. And, you know, something I think that we forget sometimes is, you know, what seems obvious, what seems like an obvious connection between your research and the economy, national security, etc., might seem really obvious to you, but might not really be obvious to someone unfamiliar with the science. And because you're the person who's requesting something of them, it's really your job to clearly demonstrate the connection for an office. So over the next week, you know, I'd really like for you to spend a few hours doing some research on the offices from the list that your staff lead will send you. You'll want to get an idea of how you could explain the value of your research, as well as the value of broader Earth and space science. And we'll be updating the website with more information as well to help you craft your message. And next week, when you guys are here in DC, we'll sit down in teams during the workshop and talk about our strategy for each office together. So don't feel like you have to have it all figured out before you arrive. And with that, we'll take questions.
Awesome. We already have a number of questions already in, so we'll go down the line and try to answer as many as possible.
Yeah, so first we'll start off with Denise asked, are there any other agencies such as the Department of Energy in the funding ask? Timia, I'm going to let you handle this one.
Yes, so we do have other asks for other agencies, particularly for things like DOE Office of Science. One thing that we usually don't comment on are regulatory type things. So we usually try to focus on the research office in other agencies. So you'll see a line in our ask document that tries to include robust science funding at other agencies, specifically targeted at research funding. But if you have something in particular, like a program that you want to talk about, or if you're really interested, in this case DOE, please talk to us and we're happy to help you craft that message.
Great. So Kimberly had a question about the pre-webinar packet and where she can access that. I'm just going to go to the next slide. Sorry, folks. Well, I thought the address was on there, but the address is, you should have received it in email from your staff lead, and we'll definitely make sure you get that in email. But I believe, do you know the address offhand?
Yes, it's sciencepolicy.agu.org/CVD2017. So there you'll find the pre-webinar packet materials. That was also where you registered for the webinar. It has more of the preliminary schedule and information about where to contact people for logistics. So we'll be updating that same site with more information and one-pagers and things like that that will be useful for you before the workshop.
Great. So Christine says, I'm a part-time federal employee. Does that mean I should simply avoid bringing up funding?
Well, one of the great things about CVD is that you will be in a team. So even if you're not the specific person asking for funding, there will likely be another person on your team who can make that request. So if you are unsure if you're a part-time federal employee at all, I would probably refrain from making that ask. You can always check with your, say, government relations office. They might have more information on what you can and cannot do. But if you're unsure at all, don't feel like that ask will never be made. We will be there. We will be asking for that, and we can tailor an ask that is appropriate for you.
Yeah. So Raphael asked, my institution's research activities are responsible for a number of opportunities to young scientists. They're under threat by the NASA Education branch budget cuts. Should this matter be directly approached or tied into the general request for a 5% NASA budget increase for FY18? So Raphael, I would actually say, I believe if I'm not mistaken, that this was one of the line items that got severely cut in the president's skinny budget. So I would say I would actually specifically call out, this specific line item in addition. You know, I would mention specifically, since it was one of the very few things that was actually referenced in the president's budget, I would call that out specifically in addition to actually making the request for an increase in funding for NASA. And I think since you're on my team and we'll be meeting with Florida legislators, I think talking specifically about those programs will also be important. And I know a lot of people are big fans of Space Grant as well. So if I think giving them even more ammunition to kind of defend these programs on the Hill will probably be very valuable.
So Raphael also has the next question. Some representatives seem very reluctant to approach the climate change subject. What would be the best approach to introduce the topic to further discuss issues such as budget cuts for Earth monitoring programs and initiatives? Good question.
So I have a couple of suggestions. One thing is that, you know, kind of those talking points that we referenced earlier, really linking that type of research back to the benefits it brings to the economy, public health, national security, really making sure that you do research into your legislator and see what their priority is, you know, and really trying to make the case for, you know, if they really care about the economy, that we end up saving more money by investing these programs than if we didn't. And in addition, really making that as local as possible. Their priority is probably to be reelected. So if their constituents, you know, disagree with, you know, may not agree with climate change research, there's a way around that, and there's a way to talk about that issue in a way that their constituents care about. And then I would also say that you could talk about the value of Earth observations, not necessarily in relationship to climate change. You could talk about the other values of those programs without having to really dive into a subject that they might find contentious.
And remember that we will help you with the framing of these messages, so don't feel like you have to come up with all of that on your own. We'll give you some tips and pointers for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would also say, just to kind of, I think, echo something Carissa said, the message is really going to be different for each office. And some of them you can just come right out and say, I'm really concerned about this, we really need to be studying climate change. And some of them it might be more like we really need to monitor you know, coastal flood zones or something like that. It's just so I think your message might be the same, but the language is going to be different.
Yeah. And you might be surprised that your legislator might have a view on something, but the staffer that you meet with might have a more science-friendly position on topics, I'll say. So you might be surprised that the reception you get from some offices that you walk into thinking that it's not going to be a good meeting, those might end up being your best meetings.
Great.
I see Daniel's question. Do you recommend that we bring printed one-pagers with us, or we work on them with you and print them out on site? We would recommend that you bring them with you, and we are happy to work with you on those if you want to send drafts or anything. Daniel, you're on my team, so feel free to send me a draft.
Great. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, hearing no other questions, I just want to say thank you guys again for taking some time to do some prep work with us today. Your staff lead should be in touch with you to introduce you to your other team members, probably give you a preliminary set of members that you, meetings that they will try to be scheduling for you. And also, we will be updating sciencepolicy.agu.org/CVD 2017. So please keep going back to that site. I know we're going to have some resources on there, including these slides, as well as a worksheet to help you get started thinking about your message as well. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.